Keep going on.
I can.
Okay, so anyway, anything we should pray about tonight? Linda's already asked that we would keep her husband in our prayers and some of the stresses he's under, some of the struggles he's going through. So let's pray for him. What else? So we're going to look at Amos chapters 1 and 2 tonight. If you had a chance to read it, then I'm interested in your thoughts. What did you see here? What questions do you have? What makes it difficult to understand reading through these two chapters?
Well, I read them, and most of the first chapter and part of the second are prophecies about Israel and Judah's neighbors. And it seems like God is angry about their treatment of each other in the way that it sounds like they're constantly fighting with each other for, I would assume, dominance in the region. And God is not pleased with the way they wage war against it. It sounds like they're unnecessarily cruel in the way that they wage war against each other. So I think that's interesting because they're not believers in God, but yet He's holding them accountable for their behavior towards each other.
Yeah, he definitely is holding them accountable toward for their behavior toward each other, which is interesting. As you say, they're not, they don't worship the God of Israel. They wouldn't necessarily have anything to do with the God of Israel. So what is he holding them responsible for is one of the questions that people ask sometimes about this section. How could he hold them responsible for something if he hadn't revealed himself to them as he did to Israel? It seems like probably there's, as today, there were some assumptions about how you wage war, or even some sort of rules about how you fight a war. Now the fact that those rules were probably pretty regularly ignored doesn't change the fact that there do seem to be some rules that it's assumed that people should follow. And so that's probably what's going on. You've got this, because it all does seem to have to do with, things done in wartime, things done in the heat of battle or whatever. And God is holding them responsible. And it's interesting. It's not the only place in the prophets where God holds other nations responsible for actions. Jeremiah is one famously that has a long section with other nations that God holds responsible. But yeah, it's these nations all around them. Josh, you can pop that map up if you want to, so we can see these nations that just shared. These nations that are all around Israel here. You have the Phoenicians with Tyre, northwest there. Gilead, you have Ammon, you have Moab, you have the Edomites, you have the Philistines, all of these nations around, right around Israel and Judah are the nations that are referred to here.
Well, we don't know exactly to what extent God has revealed himself to these nations, surely to a sufficient extent to require adherence to these standards.
Let's remember what Paul said too. Evidence in the creation holds all mankind to some degree responsible for their behavior.
Right,
He said that from his letters, and
Right.
that's a lot of truth to that. People can look around and see, if they want to, that this didn't just happen, out of from some primeval ooze, some people think aliens came down from another galaxy and started the earth, they have all kinds of theories that don't make any sense.
And it's probably less even than creation, that all of these nations would have had their own explanations about where creation had come from.
Yeah.
They had their own gods, and they would have created those gods. But they would have had these, this sort of agreed upon standard of behavior that was sort of the bare minimum.
So they have it today, right?
Don't sell each other into slavery, things like sort of the bare minimum that was assumed that no one should do.
No, it's the Geneva Convention, you've heard of that?
Yeah, kind of
They had
a
their own Geneva Convention.
kind of a Geneva Convention.
On understanding how to conduct war and prisoners and all that kind of stuff. And not everybody follows it, but it does some good at times.
Right. What else did you notice? Anything else that you noticed about the section that we read? Well, $1 million question. So what? Yeah, what does this have to do with us, right? That's kind of the struggle in the prophets that a lot of times we have. What exactly does this have to do with us? In the prophets, if you don't see any obvious Jesus-y kind of prophecies, it's sometimes hard to figure out, all right, well, what does this mean for me? Why, how does this have anything to do with how I'm going to behave at work tomorrow, or with my kids, or how does this change my faith life, my prayer life, whatever. So that's some of what we're going to talk about as we sort of wander through this tonight. One of the things you notice is the structure. There's a very definite structure to this thing, and maybe you kind of caught that or caught some aspects of it as you read through these first two chapters. It's not just a prose kind of. There's obviously a lot of care taken in the way this is put together, and that's because this is poetry. Poetry often is something, always is something you have to craft and spend some time on the artistic side of it, and you have that with Amos. You have the reason that most modern translations of Amos will sort of break it up into lines is because they're trying to sort of give you a sense of the Hebrew poetry that's here. In Hebrew poetry, you're looking for things like parallel ideas. You're looking for things like matching structure. You're looking for rhythm. You're looking for repetition. You're sort of looking for these patterns. It doesn't always rhyme. Sometimes it rhymes, or at least there's sort of words that connect to each other or sound alike. But rhyme isn't really the main thing. It's more like the rhythm of it, the meter of it, and the ideas of it. So the basic structure is you're going to always have in all of these messages to these nations, it starts how? How does it begin?
This is what the Lord says.
This is what the Lord says. Thus saith the Lord, right? This is a message from God. So it's real clear, and it's not God, it's the Lord, it's Yahweh. It's the covenant name that God used when he revealed himself to Israel. So,
And then it's generally repeated at the end.
yes, and at the end, something like
Says the Lord.
says the
Sovereign
Lord,
says the
or right,
Lord.
yeah, something along those lines. Correct. It's bracketed around the whole thing. This is a message from God. This isn't just Amos's idea. This is from God. And then you have this interesting section: for 3 sins of blank, even for 4, I will not relent, is the way the NIV English translation renders it. So I'm not going to hold back. For 3 sins, look at the first one, verse 3. For 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not relent. This is actually used in Proverbs sometimes. You see this in Proverbs. For 3 sins of blank, even for 4. In Proverbs, always when you have that, you have 4 sins listed. The interesting thing is that in almost all of these, you only have one sin, or maybe one sin broken up into two different kinds of expressions of it. Maybe in a couple of places you have more than one sin, until you get to Israel. Spoiler alert for next week. When we get to Israel, there's four. And it's almost like you have this sort of, well, these other nations are doing some bad things, but Israel is really doing some bad things. And so the cumulative effect is all these other nations are sort of less sinful than Israel. And then you have the condemnation or the sin that's mentioned because, and you have several different things, but that's even broken down. There's six, and they're broken into kind of couplets. The first two have references to the king or the kings of the respective nations, multiple references, placing blame on the leadership and consequences on the leadership. The second pair in verses 9 and following and 11 and following are the shortest. They're the judgment on Tyre and the judgment on Edom. And you see the parallelism. Tyre disregarded the treaty of brotherhood, and Edom pursued his brother with the sword. Edom's charged also with unchecked anger. And this lack of brotherhood causes, in the case of Tyre, human trafficking. They're selling off captives taken in battle into slavery. And in Edom's case, it's unchecked, just random slaughter, where they're just full of rage, just venting all of their fury in this horrible slaughter. And then the third pair, you have the really kind of awful thing in Ammon. Ammon is condemned for killing pregnant women and their babies. And then Moab condemned for burning the bones of Edom's king, which is kind of an interesting choice there. It's a way of desecrating the tomb, a way of sort of repudiating the past and repudiating the history, destroying the history of this nation. And both nations are judged. There will be war cries as both nations are judged. Their kings and officials are going to go into exile and be destroyed. So you have those condemnations there that let's just go through. Look at what are some of the things that these nations are condemned for as you scroll through verses chapter 1 verse 3 through chapter 2 verse whatever it is 3 as well. What are some of the things that these nations are condemned for?
Well, one
oppression for
Well,
religion.
Hang on 1 minute.
poetic language. She threshed Gilead with sledges having iron teeth. I'm assuming it's some sort of
The figure of
for the
speech.
time, like a super weapon or something that really caused a lot of damage.
Well, the sledges probably are threshing sledges they're talking about, and the iron teeth would really, threshing is where you break up the usable wheat from the chaff, and so the picture is just sort of crushing them. The sledges that had iron teeth would really crush the wheat and really break it up.
Oh, okay,
And
so
so, yeah.
like they just destroyed their harvest so that they wouldn't be able to
Possibly,
use it, maybe?
or it's just more a figure of speech. There's actually a figure of speech in 2 Kings.
People or something.
Yeah, 2 Kings 13, there's a reference to the king of Aram making Israel's army like the dust at threshing time. Think of you'd sort of, after you threshed it, you'd sort of throw what was there in the air and the wind would blow away the chaff. So you'd have it be dusty and just, picture that dust being just blown away on the wind. And that's kind of what you have here.
I have a note here, it says the figure of speech for harsh, maybe violent measures that people would take.
Yeah.
Like in our day, people take harsh measures, violence on every day.
Not enough to win, you have to crush, you have to utterly destroy, utterly,
Image, you know.
utterly put down these people. And so, yeah, you get that, you get that here. What else? What are some of the other things? Huh? Oh, Linda, did you have something?
I've forgotten. That's okay.
Okay.
What else
Sorry.
I'm sorry. That's all right.
What else? What else do we see?
Well, in a couple of places, they took captive whole communities and then sold them, two of them. Gaza and Tyre did that.
We got a slave trade going.
Yep.
That's what that means.
Exactly. Yeah, there's
Nothing new under the sun.
human trafficking, right? There's this trafficking going on and slaves, and God, this is reprehensible to God. And so he condemns it in the strongest possible terms. There were slaves in Israel, right? But they were more, it was more like indentured servitude, which I don't know if that's great, but you're not taking, the idea is not you take people forcibly and then you sell them somewhere else and you treat them like goods, like commodities to be bought and sold.
Well, sometimes in indentured servitude, the person would be in that situation because they owed a debt.
Yeah.
And so they would spend their period of servitude paying off the debt.
Right.
So
Right,
that's
exactly.
a little different. from
Exactly.
this.
Exactly. So yeah, there's that the violent crushing and destruction. There's selling people into slavery. What else do you see that God condemns these nations for?
One thing I noticed was it's all of these other nations did this to their neighbors,
Yeah.
not to their own people. God's condemning them for things they did in war with another nation, which is an interesting contrast to Israel, because with Israel, God is primarily concerned with how they treat each other instead of how they treat
Yeah. This is treatment of other nations, citizens of other nations for the most part, and it is a little different in Israel. And that probably relates to the fact that Israel's under a covenant with God, right? Israel's in this covenant in which they agree to certain things, and some of those, the righteousness and the judgment, the justice in the covenant has to do with the way you treat one another. So, yeah, but yeah, all these nations are doing this to the nations around them. Of course, you always, you never treat your own badly, right? Sometimes you do, but
Israel did.
right, but it's easy to treat the others badly. It's easy to treat the people who aren't like you badly, and that's why we get all the horrible things that still are part of our world. We are able to sort of dehumanize people who aren't like us. They're not.
Like Tyre, she sold whole communities of captives.
Yep.
Verse 9.
Yep, Tyre had a thriving slave trade, apparently.
This kind of, you might think of this as a complete non sequitur, but this brings me to something that has always bothered me about some of the early books like Joshua, and where, after the Israelites, after they go into the promised land, they're told to utterly destroy all the people living in these cities that they conquered. And that has always bothered me, because just the idea of killing every living thing, women, children, anybody, I think it would bother anybody, but the fact that God told them to do it and punished them when they didn't do it. Yeah. Again, that seems, it's always bothered me. And now God is saying here, he's punishing these cities for doing cruel things, but in no case did they ever destroy
Exterminate
the
a
whole
whole- yeah,
city.
right.
So I'm not gonna say God's inconsistent, but there seems to be,
It seems inconsistent, yeah. I mean,
Yes.
Yeah,
or double standard.
yeah, it does, and I think it's a fair
And I do
observation.
understand some of God's reasons for wanting them to do that, because he was trying to keep them from being affected by the customs of those people, but it seems.
I mean, it's a fair observation, and I think you're right. I think for almost anyone, you look at some of those stories in Joshua, you look at some as Israel enters the promised land, or Samuel and Kings, where, Saul lets some of the, I always forget, the Amalekites, some of the Amalekites live, the king, and keep some of their property, their livestock, and God basically breaks things off with Saul because of that. And you struggle with that, and I know that, and I think it's fair to struggle with that, and I understand. I mean, there's a Hebrew word there. These things are devoted to the Lord. They're given over to God for destruction. To me, that doesn't necessarily make it easier to swallow. It's maybe even harder to swallow. Sort of putting God's name on something like that. And there are texts that talk about how God used Israel to judge those nations and it boils down to, I think for me, either you believe that God is good or you don't. And if you do, then you say, all right, I don't like this. I'm not comfortable with it.
I don't understand.
I don't understand it, but I'm willing to sort of put that off to the side and let it sit and
They say in Job, or was it Job, who are you to question
Right.
my
right.
actions? And so
Yeah.
You may have already expounded on this, I'm sorry, I found my book things here. Verse 9, what is reference to a treaty of brotherhood in my version?
Yeah.
Who had treaties like that?
Well, almost any treaty could be thought of as a treaty of brotherhood. One of the ways, some of the language of the treaty in the ancient Near East would be, we are brothers. Or if you're less equal, one king is the father and the other king is the son, so depending on the relative power between the nations. But a pretty even treaty between pretty even nations would be sort of a treaty of brotherhood. So that may be what's going on there.
Well, when Israel was coming from Egypt to the promised land, the Lord said, circumvent Edom. Those are your brothers.
That's later in Amos. It talks about, I think, doesn't Edom refer to the treaty of brotherhood as well?
I don't know if they had a written treaty.
Right.
Yeah, he says.
Yeah, he pursued his brother with a sword. And that's Edom, and yeah, that's likely a. Trying to look around my iPad down there. That's likely the reference to the relationship between Edom and Israel. Edom, of course, in the Bible is pictured as coming from Esau, who is Jacob's brother. So Jacob was the progenitor of Israel, Esau the progenitor of Edom, and so in a sense they really were. They were literally brother nations because they came from brothers. And that's interesting. That the couple of references there to, these treaties are not just to be for convenience, right? This makes you brothers, and if you violate them, you have you've committed this sinful act. You've broken faith, and God really has something to say about that. Well, you know, you get the idea, right? So there's always then, the third part of the structure that's always there is, I will send fire that will consume her fortresses. And sometimes the judgment is sort of amplified on, but always it has that. I will send fire that will consume her fortresses. The fortresses are the citadels, the royal citadels. And so it really looks like that a lot of these judgments are directed more or less at the royalty of these nations, the leaders of these nations, which I suppose makes sense, right? I mean, they're the ones making the decisions, or at least responsible for them. And so they're, you know, they're the ones who are held responsible for these acts. So other things you notice here that you want to call attention to, or that you know have questions about, or want to comment on.
Did these things happen?
I mean,
Historically?
in some cases, we know some things that happened. The Treaty of Brotherhood, there was a treaty Solomon made a treaty with the king of Tyre back in 1 Kings 5. We know that. Obadiah talks about Edom mocking Jerusalem when when the Babylonians came. That would have been later than Amos, of course, but maybe it illustrates kind of an attitude that Edom had toward Israel. I mean, yeah, we know some of these things. We know.
Did these punish or were these cities consumed?
Well, I mean, eventually, yeah. I mean, yeah, eventually they were. I believe it's the Edomites, no, it's the Arameans. One of the punishments is they will go into exile to Kir, K-I-R. We don't really know where that is, but Amos refers to it later in the book as the land of origin. The Arameans came from there. So if that's the case, then it's like God is sort of reversing their history or deleting their history, right? They've come from this land and they've created this empire, and now God is wiping off the map and sending them back to where they came from. That actually, we see that in 2 Kings 16, verse 9. We see a deportation of Arab to Kir. So, yeah, some of these things did happen. And we have records of it in Scripture. Other comments about what you see here, or questions? So now we have to address this question. So what? What does this mean to us, right? So it got me thinking. How do we conceive of a Christian nation? When we think of a Christian nation, what does it look like? What do we imagine a Christian nation would look like? And I got thinking that I think we almost always think of it strictly in terms of personal liberty to worship God, to not be constrained in that at all. We kind of like, I think sometimes, and I'm being general here, but I think we like a nation sometimes where God is acknowledged, publicly by the leaders of the nation as important to our history. I think that's something that has been important to us in the past. I
Also, how do we treat each other?
Exactly. I mean,
how do we treat those who are poor?
Yeah.
How do we treat each other in general?
Yeah.
Are we kind to each other? Do we try to help those who need something?
Right, and I that's kind of the tension for me, that sometimes we think of a Christian nation strictly in terms of what's comfortable and what, a personal liberty for us. But there's all kinds of things here that, that Amos is talking about that go far beyond, personal liberty for us and have to do with, the way we treat the most vulnerable, the way we treat people who are in tough situations, the way we deal with, some of our history. I'm going through this and I'm thinking, slave trading, well, we have a history of that. And I'm thinking, that's many of the things here in our, and that come up in Amos. I mean, did we ever break treaties with anybody? Well, I imagine if you asked many of the Native American tribes that question, that they would say, yes, America broke treaties with us, broke faith with us. I think there's a whole litany of things that you can look back on and even today that we're struggling with the effects of, with racism, with, what do you do with memorials to people who really don't need to have memorials, built for them. There's these sort of struggles that we have as a country, and I know that, as individual Christians, we're not responsible for the entire history of our country, but I think we still have to sort of come to grips with that and grapple with that in some way. Maybe we don't always do that very well because it makes us uncomfortable. But I think this, to me, these verses kind of call us to deal with some of that history, where we came from and what our nation has looked like in the past and still looks like sometimes.
I think in the past, we kind of, a lot of us at least felt we were a Christian nation because Christians are a majority.
Yeah.
Now that's no longer true. Well, I think we still have a little majority, but it's changing. We're going down, unfortunately. But yeah, you look at the history, and then if we were a Christian nation, shame on us. In a lot of ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
what's going on here?
I mean, fair enough. We had a Christian majority at some point. But there was a lot going on that I think it was hard to support and hard to. And I know that none of us sitting here would try to argue that any of those things were okay now, but it's just it makes us sort of think about, right, how do we live now, and what does our nation look like now, and how do we as Christians want to
read it anymore.
Hello? Does somebody want to say something? Okay. How do we as Christians sort of deal with that reality? That's I think some fair questions that this text sort of raises for us.
In Leviticus, isn't there kind of a Old Testament version of the golden rule? I mean, they were subject to that, we're all subject to that, so it's like nothing new today.
Yeah.
It's kind of human nature, Satan, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, we kind of like to think we got better, right? and certainly there are things better in our world than were in their world, but I don't know, human nature, I don't think has gotten much better.
It is not.
I think that's for sure. And what do you do with that? Well, I think that's why it's always, every generation has to be honest about who are we and how are we living, and what do we sort of accept without really considering it and thinking about it, and how do we sometimes pursue the things that make us comfortable personally, to the extent at the expense of some of these conditions that exist elsewhere that we could do something about. There's no easy answer to that, but I think it does require us as believers in a God who cares about all nations and who cares about the way nations treat one another. Those and don't want to step on toes, but those Native American nations, those indigenous nations that we displaced as we moved into this country, God cared about them. You know, God cared about what happened. God cared about those Africans that we brought forcibly to this nation and treated like currency and treated like, you know, property, yeah. God cared about them. God cared about those, you know, what happened in those places, those communities where we took people away. What happened to those communities as a result of that? You know, the ripple effects of that. God cared about those communities just as much as he cared about the United States and our growth and our expansion, maybe more. And I think, you know, I think we just need to sort of see that and you know, the immigrants that are at our borders and trying to come to our nation for asylum or whatever. I don't know the answer. It's tough questions, but God cares about them. You know, God cares about the people in our inner cities, and God cares. They're different from us. They're not like us, and we can even sort of try to make them at times the bad guys, but you know, God cares, and we have to be aware of how we treat them and how we go about addressing some of these problems and the language we use and the way we talk about it. And, you know, I'm rambling, but this sort of surfaced some of those questions for me. Comments or thoughts or whatever. Please save me. One of the things that comes up here, what time is it? One of the things that comes up here, I'll make this last point and then we'll wind it up if there's no more comments. But one of the things that comes up to me is how power, if as it seems, God is particularly addressing the royalty, the leaders of these nations, how power can create these situations and almost inevitably does. The more unchecked power that people have, the more likely it seems that we have these kinds of situations that arise, this mistreatment of people and oppression and abuse and taking advantage and it just seems like they go together inevitably. And you know, that it happens on an international and a national level, but it happens at a local level too. It even happens in the church. You're hearing more and more stories about people who have suffered at the hands of church leaders who had a lot of ability to do what they wanted and not too many people who would tell them no. And inevitably, this kind of thing is the result. This is what occurs because of it.
Power corrupts.
Power corrupts. Yeah. Power corrupts.
In most of these cases, God specifically says, I'm going to kill the king or send the king into exile.
If power is the problem, we'll take care of that, right?
Right, I mean, the people are going to suffer.
Yeah.
Because of what their leaders have done.
Right.
The leaders are not going to be spared.
Yeah, right.
It wasn't God's plan that Israel have a king.
That's right.
Maybe we can say it wasn't God's plan that there would be any kings anywhere.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, certainly that's God's response when the people say, you know, Samuel, give us a king so that we'll be like the other nations. It's ironic, you know, to hear that statement and read Amos. You know, they want to be like the other nations. They wanted a king so they can be like these other nations. And look at what these other nations were doing. Look at what it was.
How many kings viewed themselves as gods?
Yep.
Various
Oh, that's right.
circumstances.
That's right. So yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. You know that God always knew that, and you know, and when Samuel says, you know, God, they've rejected me as king. And God says, no, they rejected me as king. And tell them this, tell them, here's what the king will do. The king will take, and he will take, and he will take, and he will take everything he can, and then he'll want more. And he warned them that was what it was going to be. And that's what you see here in Amos. You see this power, just this unchecked power, just creating these horrible catastrophes, extinction level events because of this power. Well, I mean, we haven't changed that much, and anywhere there's power, be it in the church or be it in a nation or anywhere there's a power differential, somebody is going to take, and somebody is going to be the poorer for it. And so, I mean, the question that to me that kind of comes up out of all this, so what do we do about our history as a nation, or what do we do about our history in the church? I mean, we can be made to feel, we resist the idea that that was them, that was the earlier generations, that was people before us, but that doesn't, I think, either, it's not honest about human nature, and it's not honest about our own role in sort of perpetuating things. And those of us who have enjoyed some of the results of our ancestors' abusive behavior probably ought to think about that and consider that and kind of think about how we confront that and deal with that. But maybe a better question is, how do we contribute to a society that's repentant over our history and that's determined that we're not going to repeat it and make the same mistakes? How do we as Christians contribute to that kind of a world that pushes away, holds at arm's length this violence and these power plays, and instead more and more we behave like Jesus, the one who submitted himself and came to serve, not to be served. And, I think it raises all sorts of questions we've got to wrestle with as believers. What else? Well, thank you very much for your thoughts and your participation. Next week we will look at condemnation of two more nations. One, these will be more familiar to you, Judah and Israel, because God has something to say to both Judah and Israel as well. While it's sometimes fun to hear God pick on the people around you who aren't you, it's awfully hard to hear him pick on you. And that's what Israel and Judah are in for, and maybe what we're in for.
It kind of sets it up, and the people hearing this, they're going to, yeah, he's gonna get these guys doing, and then all of a sudden, Judah. Now, and they don't get much mention here.
No, yeah,
they've done things, but Israel really
because this, don't forget, this prophecy is not addressed to Moab or Philistia or even Judah. This prophecy is addressed to the 10 northern kingdoms, Israel.
So all these, all this bad stuff and then it's building and then all of a sudden all these things that are going to happen to Israel.
It's a setup.
Yeah. Very effective.
All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Hope you all have a great week.
You too.
Thank you. Hope you enjoying your gift, Laura.
Yes, thank you so much.
We are. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.